Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Murphy. I have the honor of representing Connecticut in the United States Senate. I'm joined here by my friend and colleague, Secretary of State Denise Merrill. We are here to talk about our efforts to make sure that every voter in Connecticut gets to cast a ballot this November, and our efforts to make sure that foreign governments do not improperly interfere in the casting of those ballots or in the election debate that we are about to enter into. There is no doubt that the Russian government intends to try to rig the 2020 election just as they interfered in the 2016 election. I am very worried that this administration is not taking seriously the threat of Russian interference. And I'm beginning to be more and more worried that this White House is intentionally looking the other way because it knows that the Russian government is ultimately looking to reelect this president. Secretary Merrill's office protects elections on behalf of every voter and every citizen of this state. Her job is to just make sure that these elections are conducted in a free and fair manner. But I also want to make sure that when voters are getting information, when they are seeking to learn things about the candidates, that they are not hearing from hidden foreign sources trying to disguise themselves as domestic actors. And so it's important for us to talk about both the physical security of people's ballots to make sure that our election processes are protected. But it's also really important for us to talk about making sure that we uncover the kind of information interference that the Russians intend to use in the coming 2 months. The White House likes to talk about the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians all in one breath. Let's be very clear. The Chinese and the Iranians have nothing compared to what the Russians have when it comes to the capability to mess with our elections. And in fact, it's far from certain as to whether the Russians and the Iranians, it's far from certain whether the Chinese and the Iranians even have the intent to impact our elections on behalf of one candidate or the other. There is only one foreign government that has the capability to interfere in our elections and has the clear desire to weigh in on behalf of one side, and that is the Russian government. Right now, we see the Russians flooding Facebook and Twitter with disinformation. Over half of the content on Twitter today regarding coronavirus is likely coming from foreign sources. Of the content on social media today regarding Reopen America campaigns and messaging, a recent study suggests 60 to 70% of that is foreign-based propaganda, most likely coming from Russia. And so it's really important that voters make sure to be careful about where their information is coming from. I have a big presence on Twitter and Facebook, but I wouldn't recommend that voters get their information about Joe Biden or Donald Trump from Twitter or Facebook. Go to a news source that you trust, where you know that it's Americans that are providing the content. Now, maybe Fox News is biased one way and MSNBC is biased the other way, but at least those are Americans who are providing you with content rather than what you're finding on social media platforms today, which is often, sometimes more often than not, coming from foreign sources, most likely the Russians. Additionally, part of the reason why I'm incredibly worried about how serious this administration is taking Russian interference is because they just announced that they are not going to brief Congress any longer about foreign interference efforts. There's no good reason not to brief Congress other than you are interested in covering something up. What's the administration hiding? Why would they stop career civil servants from being able to tell members of Congress, many of which are on the ballot this November, whether or not the Russians are increasing their interference efforts? This president talked a half a dozen times with Vladimir Putin over the spring and summer. What did they talk about? Why aren't we receiving briefings about the extent of Russian interference efforts? What is attempting to be hidden from members of Congress and the American public? I have said this before, and I'll say it again before I turn it over to Secretary Merrill. The intelligence services have very specific information about who in the United States that's providing content regarding the 2020 election is a Russian agent. Our intelligence services know the names of the Russian agents who are speaking on TV in the United States, who are sending information packets to members of Congress. The intelligence services should make that information public. I hope it doesn't fall on Congress to do it ourselves, but before this election reaches its final weeks, voters should know who the Russian agents are and who they aren't when they're listening to information. Finally, as I turn it over to Secretary Merrill, we've done a great job here in Connecticut of utilizing both state resources and federal resources to make sure that our elections are as protected as possible from outside interference. The work that Secretary Merrill has done in conjunction with our local election enforcement and administration officials allows me to tell a really positive story in Washington about why we need additional funds. We're always looking for more money and more funding, but we have taken steps in this state to make sure that it will be as hard as humanly possible for the Russians or anybody else to try to manipulate the voter rolls or the operations of Election Day itself. And I want to reserve that brief for Secretary Merrill.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I can't tell you how important it has been, the efforts of our congressional delegation to get us the resources that we have needed to be able to shore up our defenses here in Connecticut. And before I tell you exactly what we're doing here in Connecticut, I just want to go back a little bit to how this started. The first time we were aware of these activities was really after the 2016 election, when we were told that Connecticut was one of the first 21 states identified as being a state where there was an attempted breach of our voter rolls. It was not successful. And we didn't know anything about it at the time because it was all secure and classified information. The first we heard about it was in testimony to Congress at the time. And of course, we were horrified. And I did set to work at that time to set up a national committee that is composed of secretaries of state and the various law enforcement and security agencies to be able to have communication between the states and the federal government on these issues. Since that time, I've been in numerous secure briefings with the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the national security agencies, and it has been an invaluable source of information for us here in the States because we're on the front lines. We're the ones that have to know if something's going on with our systems and who's identifying these people. And there have been multiple Russian IP addresses identified as those trying to influence both our systems, but also the campaign of disinformation, which this committee that's been set up with these briefings is very clear that literally hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on this effort, and it's an ongoing effort and has been since 2016. So that being said, Congress did go to work. They got us some resources. Connecticut received about $5 million just to shore up our security. That's separate from the other money we now have in a separate grant to help the towns manage the absentee ballot, so I don't want anybody to think it's not the same grant. This specific grant we have used to do a number of things since 2016, including trying to make sure that every local connection is secure. That has been our biggest challenge because we in Connecticut don't have counties, so we manage elections at the local level, 169 drop points for the system like the voter registry, and for the election management system, which I think is the one to watch because that's where we report results. And those are the two systems that are actually on the internet and could be hacked, arguably. And we have done a lot to make sure that the towns are running secure software. We've instituted dual authentication, for example. Password changes have to be used now, and a lot of training of local officials, because what we've seen in other states where these incursions have been successful in some cases, it comes in through things like phishing emails. We're all familiar with this from our own computers. You know, you have to constantly be watching for people trying to get in. And if some Russian adversary group got in through a phishing email in a local registrar or clerk's office, that would impact the entire system. So that's where we put our first energy. We have now completed an asset analysis of every town. We've had the help of the National Guard in this effort because certainly it was a big effort. And now we're fairly confident that the towns now have secure systems. They're running secure software, up-to-date software, and that the local officials have training in how to manage these systems. We are also, just recently, we have hired a person just to work on the disinformation problem because we are anticipating that there will not only be disinformation from these Russian adversaries about candidates and parties, it will also be aimed at trying to confuse voters about Election Day, for example. We've already seen some of that in previous elections. So we're going to be watching for that. We're hopeful that we can, sort of head some of that off at the pass. And we will have a very significant effort to do something we call Squint, which is a program that is kind of like see something, say something, and it will be every local official will be given information on how to recognize anomalies, shall we say, in the systems and be able to report them to someone who can do something about it. So those are just kind of the highlights. We've done a lot more in terms of hardware, hardening our hardware. We've had assistance from the Department of Homeland Security who have come in and given us some products to help what they call cyber cleanse our systems. We're doing everything we can to make sure that at least our hardware and our systems are up to date, are secure as they can be, both at the state and the local level. So I just want to assure the voters that we are on top of this. We are doing everything we can. But needless to say, it's like a needle in the haystack sort of situation. One of the IT people told me we get about 1 million hits a day on our voter registry. Just people wanting the information from that registry. Now, obviously, they're not all nefarious, but mixed in there, they have to try to identify where the problems are. So that's the kind of thing we're up against. It is terribly important that we not let foreign powers interfere with our elections. And we are all committed on the ground to doing this. And again, I just want to thank Congress for acting on this. There's no way the state would have been able to produce all this on our own. So I think I'll leave it there and see if there's any questions. But yeah.
Can you give us any examples of this disinformation? Like, is there a specific tweet or a specific Facebook post or something that says, this is a Russian actor trying to, get at our system?
Well, I mean, there are thousands of Twitter accounts that are being taken down on a weekly basis. So these social media platforms are getting better at identifying when these are Russian bots. These are essentially computers that are coming up with algorithms to post information online. As I mentioned, We think right now the Russians are focused on trying to divide America when it comes to our response to COVID-19. They see that as a mechanism by which to both promote division in the United States, but also to elevate President Trump's standing. The Russians clearly want to re-elect Donald Trump, and by promoting Reopen America online, they clearly see that as beneficial to him. So, but at the same time, there's obviously a lot of legitimate content on social media regarding people's desire to have greater access to schools and public places and businesses. And so it's difficult in that, while studies suggest that 60% of Reopen America content is foreign produced, that doesn't mean that it's all legitimate. I think the other thing we can point to that's concerning is this revelation this week that a sort of Russian publication called Kommersant disclosed that Connecticut's voter information was on the dark web. Now, that was all public information, so it doesn't necessarily mean that there was a hack, but it wouldn't be there if it wasn't meant to be a message that the Russians and people acting on their behalf are actively trying to probe at voter lists. Remember, that's what we worry about more than anything else, is our voter lists being compromised. The actual act of voting on election day is as safe as we can make it, but the voter lists are always potentially subject to attack, and that disclosure of Connecticut voters' names and date of birth online was clearly a message that they're after us.
Are there any instances in Connecticut where votes have been compromised by foreign interference?
No, because they didn't get in. There were certainly attempts. Yes, they're knocking on the door, they're rattling the doorknobs, and that could have even been just to be, show that they could. I mean, that's what's so insidious about this entire thing. Take this article that the senator was talking about. The real point of the article was to make people not want to be on the voter list or mistrust the voter list because their information was being compromised. So even though it wasn't even true, and then it was amplified by the media. So immediately some media person bit and took that information and said, oh my God, and Connecticut was prominently featured, which is why it got my attention, because they mentioned Connecticut several times, this media guy, and that's what they're aiming for. It's really very subtle campaign. It's nothing like, I'm not as worried, frankly, about somebody getting into our voter list as I am about talking about that they're trying to get into our voter list, and that's a perfect example.
We also heard about the possibility of foreign interference in terms of putting out fake ballots, things like that. So could you give us both of your assessments on that threat? And specifically, could you tell us, what is the process used to identify a voter as that voter when they vote by mail?
Well, I'll just take the broader question, and Denise can talk about that process. There is no evidence that foreign governments have been attempting to mail fraudulent ballot information to voters. And so while the Trump administration likes to create a story that there is a security issue around absentee ballots or mail-in voting, there is no evidence that that is a program actively underway by foreign governments. And I think it's important to say that because there is plenty of evidence about what the Russians are doing, right? It's not as if we just don't know. We know that the Russians are constantly trying to get into voter lists. We know that the Russians have an active presence online. And so it's important also to see as relevant the things that the Russians and other foreign governments are not doing. And they're not trying to sort of mail fraudulent ballots out because it's hard to do. It's really hard to get away with, and Denise can talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, here in Connecticut, we don't mail ballots out. We mail applications out. There's an extensive process you have to go through to get an absentee ballot, as everyone is finding out. But those applications, you have to sign for them. It's sent to your town clerk. Everything is done at the local level. It's hard for me to imagine any broad-scale attack on the whole system because we have 169 towns and they each keep their own lists. And that application is compared against the list that's on record. They're checked off the list as having applied for a ballot. Then the ballot's mailed back to the same address. The same person has to sign it the same way. Then they have to mail it back again or put it in the ballot box. The clerk then checks off the AB, and that goes publicly on our website that you can check your name and see that you got a ballot or didn't. And then from there till election day, it's constantly compared against the list to make sure someone isn't trying to vote twice, for example. That's why we count the absentees at the end of the day, so those two lists can be compared. So there are, multiple checks and balances on the actual absentee ballots, not to mention all the checks and balances on the tabulators themselves, the fact that we vote on paper. We have every protection and best practice I can think of in this state.
What about this whole issue of double voting? Obviously, the president made his comments in North Carolina yesterday, and apparently there's been some clarification or attempts at some clarifications today. Maybe you both could comment on that situation and just the idea that somebody could get away with voting by absentee and then showing up at the poll.
Yeah, again, this just sows confusion where there's already confusion. It would be really, really difficult in Connecticut to vote twice with an absentee ballot because what I just said, this is compared. Let's just say, for example, a voter chose to get an absentee ballot and even mailed it in, but is nervous that maybe it didn't get there or maybe things change in November, so they decide, I'm just going to go to the voting booth anyway and go vote, which we don't recommend, by the way, as the president apparently did in some way, shape, or form. But if that happened, it would still come out that they'd only be able to vote once because we receive those absentee ballots, but at the end of the night, it's all compared against who is checked off on the list. And like I say, it's very local. We only allow you to vote in one precinct in Connecticut. Many states have much broader ways to vote than we do, but I have to say in this instance, it's hard to imagine that someone would slip through the cracks.
So how many days do we expect? Sorry.
That's okay. Can you give us an update on the absentee ballot process? And are you at all concerned about a shortage of poll workers on election day?
Okay. Absentee ballot process, we're on track. The applications will be mailed next week, so that's all on track. The absentee ballots themselves will be sent out by the local towns. We are providing, again, through gracious federal resources, we're able to provide a lot of resource to the towns to be able to hire extra help if they need it to process the ballots. The Postal Service is a bit of an unknown, but fortunately we have the ballot boxes so people can drop them off, which proved a godsend in the primary election where we had a storm. We always have to be prepared for these kinds of things to happen, so we're trying to prepare for all these different eventualities. But we're not strangers to that in Connecticut, and in elections generally. We've had, since I've been secretary in the last 10 years, 3 different major storms 1 week before elections, and every time it was very disruptive, but we made it happen. So I'm confident it's going to be fine. Am I concerned about shortage of poll workers? We have mounted a recruitment plan for poll workers. We have about 250 people who have volunteered. But again, that's at the local level. We refer them to the local clerks and registrars. And if they want to volunteer or be paid, because many of the poll workers are paid, they go to that local level. So far, we have not heard that there's a lot of need for extra poll workers. We had a survey done of all the towns, and no one has said that they're in need. But if it's true and someone wants to volunteer or go be a poll worker, I would highly advise you contact your local town registrars and clerks and see if there's something you can do.
Let me just add. I mean, listen, given everything that has happened over the course of the last several months, a pandemic, an increased effort by foreign governments to try to mess with our elections, I just think it requires everybody just to take their responsibility to vote a little bit more seriously. Make a plan. If you're going to vote by absentee, vote as early as possible. Just take your responsibility seriously this year. Voting is still safe. It's frankly easier than it's ever been before in some respects in Connecticut because of the unique circumstances. But everybody just has to make sure that you're being very conscientious about making sure that your vote is counted. You should do that every year, but this year especially so, given the circumstances.
How many days do we anticipate?
Go ahead. Can you clarify what you think a Russian agent's going to do with my voter information?
Well, so the worst case scenario is that the Russians will get into a voter file and change it, right? So you will go down to the voting place on election day and find that you're not on the list any longer. And so I think that has always been the worry, that they would get these lists, manipulate them, and just disenfranchise a lot of people on election day, or at least, obviously we have processes for that in Connecticut, right? You can cast a provisional ballot. You have the ability to cast a vote on election day regardless of whether you're on the list or not. But their intent would likely to be to cause as much confusion and chaos as possible, so that their candidate could call into doubt the results of the election. And again, we have spent a lot of time and effort in bolstering the defenses of our voter lists. We are much more secure today than we were 2 years ago or 4 years ago. And Denise and I were just talking about this offline. I think we've both been very impressed by the folks working at the federal government, at the Department of Justice, at the FBI, at the Department of Homeland Security, on increasing the security of our voter lists. As much as I worry about what's going on in the White House, by and large, the folks who work day to day on this inside the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies have been doing pretty good work. No. I mean, the intelligence services has made it clear. This is not. I'm not telling you anything that isn't public. The intelligence services have disclosed that the Russians are operating in order to try to get Trump reelected, right? So the Russians have a clear agenda, which is the reelection of Donald Trump. Those same intelligence services would tell you that the Iranians and the Chinese don't want Trump reelected. That is not clear. But what's more important is that it's not clear the Iranians and the Chinese have either the interest in interfering in the election or the capability to do it. The only foreign government that has a stake in the election, meaning a candidate that they want to win, and the intent to interfere in the election and the capability to be successful in that interference, is Russia. And it's not that we don't pay no attention to the other nations. It's just we know the Russians have a unique blend of interest, intent, and capability that makes us all very worried.
So will you claim Russian interference if Joe Biden isn't the overwhelming winner?
Well, I think it's clear that the Russians are interfering presently. And what I'm suggesting is that, people need to go and make sure that their news sources aren't compromised by foreign governments. So, I think the only thing that would really compromise the results of the election is if we had clear evidence that the Russian government actually did get into a voter file or were able to compromise electronic voting systems. I just think when it comes to their propaganda efforts, we have to accept that as part of the American political debate, try to educate voters about where to get the best information. When it comes to whether we actually end up with a result, for me, the only thing that would compromise my faith in the election result is clear evidence that a foreign government actually interfered in the administration of the election, not the debate preceding the election.
And what about how long do we think it's going to take to get an accurate vote count on this election? How long are we going to be tallying?
In Connecticut, I think we're going to be okay. I would hasten to add that many states have changed their laws to make sure that every last vote gets counted. For example, California, I believe, which is what's called a postmark state. So your ballot, if it's postmarked by Election Day, gets counted as long as it's actually received, and they've just extended this to 10 days after the election. So you can see right there that in California, at least, if it's a close election and California is some sort of determiner, it's going to take a while. Now here in Connecticut, the legislation that was passed in special session grants the local officials an extra 48 hours to get the results tallied. I don't think it's going to take that long in most cases, but they do have that extra 48 hours. Normally, they have to get the results into the election management system by midnight on election night. And I very much think that probably at least 50% of the jurisdictions will have it in by midnight.
Thank you, everybody.